Hi, this is Paul. Yesterday I had to go down to Los Angeles for work in the church, and so I had a fair amount of time to work on sermons and actually listen to some content. And so I did, in fact, get through the entire Kanye West Lex Fridman podcast. I wouldn't say it's actually interesting. It's so chaotic. James Frazee on Twitter said manic, and certainly listening to him, you could say that. Ought to have a little bit of care diagnosing over the air. He was diagnosed with bipolar, went into that. Here's the thing with Kanye is that he's clearly very energetic. He's all over the place. One of the big back and forths, now 2.5 million views. One of the big fat back and forths is over Kanye's insistence on characterizing Jews in a particular light, the whole thing as such. And Lex keeps trying to back him into saying, well, why don't you name names instead of characterizing the whole people, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it's really difficult to know what's at play in that. I thought actually this was before the Lex interview.
Next topic. So I was really interested to see if the performer formerly known as Kanye, now Ye, I was really interested to see if he could be canceled. Because I was starting to think he might be uncancelable, but I think they've done it. And it looks like, there's more movement toward everybody canceling him. And I think even his old agent, I think his own agent or somebody he worked with, Ari, wants to cancel him. So basically all of Hollywood and anybody who's associated with or supportive of the Jewish community has pretty much joined forces and he's canceled. He's canceled. But do you want to hear a good conspiracy theory? All right, this is not mine. So this was suggested to me on a message. So I won't say who suggested it, in case they don't want their name known. But the idea is that Kanye already said, before any of this ugliness happened, he had said that he wanted to get out of his deals with Gap and Adidas. I can't think of a better way to get out of your deals. Now the question is, could he possibly have done this intentionally to cancel the deals he wanted to cancel? That couldn't have been canceled any other way, probably. Is he that smart? I don't know. I don't see anybody branding themselves as anti-Semitic to cancel a deal. That feels like something that literally nobody would do. But maybe. The reason that Ye is Ye and I'm not is because he does things that I wouldn't do, right? The very fact that the thing that made him him, and the reason we talk about him, is he doesn't do what you and I would do. So who knows? Who knows? I doubt it. Doesn't seem like a good play. It doesn't sound like a smart play. So I don't think so. But it was interesting. Now, if he hasn't clarified or corrected, what is the right?
This is after the Pierce Morgan interview, which I also watched, which was also like the Lex Fridman interview because it was more contentious. Pierce Morgan didn't seem to have the same kind of relationship with Kanye that Lex has, but again, interesting isn't quite the right word. I don't really know what the right word is.
Way to go on this. And I've said this before, but if somebody said, so here's your racism bigotry test, okay? If somebody said to you, let me tell you, my 6th grade teacher when I was a kid taught the class in direct language that Chinese people were good at business. Now, that was the most racist thing anybody ever said that I ever heard in public, like from a person with authority. And I think he mentioned, I'm not positive, but I think he mentioned the Jewish community too. I think he said, oh yeah, the Chinese and the Jews are good at business. Now,
Now, this gets interesting, of course. When I first got to the church, there was talk about there were developers that were very interested in buying the church's land because they're right on a major corner. And the developers are Chinese, and they own a bunch of supermarkets. And one of the things that actually at that time a member of the church, who was also a real estate lawyer, said to me is that some of these Chinese families are very long-term business people. Now, he didn't characterize all Chinese people or all Jewish people. He just noted in his experience that culturally, many of these Chinese families that sort of work together on a lot of these projects are very long-term thinkers and long-term planners, and they're very patient with respect to buying up property. They'll keep their eye on some property, and they'll wait a long time until sort of everything is right, and they get it at the price they want, and they have the plans that they have, and yada yada yada, and they will do this. And part of what's interesting is that there certainly are cultural elements that get passed down in cultures, positive and negative. And I can talk about, we have this little saying among the Dutch, wooden shoes, wooden head, wouldn't listen. And this is a cultural slur against Dutch people. And so, and sometimes positive, sometimes negative. There are stereotypes and generalizations that sometimes sort of mark different cultural groups and some of the habits that they generate. Now, obviously, in terms of African American history, there have been a huge number of negative ones and some positive, negative ones about African Americans. I remember one of my elementary teachers. It's amazing how many of these things come out from elementary teachers and how they get remembered. One of my elementary teachers explaining how black people sing better than white people. Okay. And you can, Spike Lee, white men can't jump. So, you get all of these things that are out there. And of course, racism for a long time in American history has been a very difficult thing for the culture to grapple with. And racism is a very complex thing for the culture to grapple with. And in many ways, what we sort of do is pick up certain propositions, or we banish certain propositions, and via these propositions, this scourge of racism, we believe, can be managed. Now, not too long ago, Rafe Kelly and John Vervaeke had what I thought was a really good substantive conversation. And there are a lot of good nuggets in there. And I put 3 clips out on the Vanderclips channel. I'm using that channel right now just to take clips from the internet that I want to keep and throw them there. And this was this little section of it.
Said that really struck me was that the answer that Peterson said that really struck me was that the answer to the corruption of the state is the virtue of the individual. Yes. And I think that's a very important message for where we are, but it's still a partial truth. This is my sense, is that unless we can literally all become Jesus, and I don't think that's possible.
Yes.
There's always incentive structures that will be sufficient to warp human behavior. Yes. So it's never sufficient to only look at the cultivation of the individual. We have to look at the systems that are incentivizing behavior that's destructive. Yeah. But again, it's this reciprocal causal relationship where we need to scale up our capacity for virtue as individuals while we're scaling up how our system creates virtue. And I think that what we've done in some sense is created a system that runs really well off of virtues that were cultivated by Christianity for a long time, yes, but no longer actually is deriving those virtues. and doesn't realize how much it's dependent on it and how fragile it is once those virtues start to disappear.
And I think this is one of the many rain shadows of the meaning crisis.
Yeah.
And this is why a lot of the social, I don't know what to call them, institutions, movements, often are desiccated versions of Christianity without even realizing it. I would add, I would say Christianity, but also at least Neoplatonic Christianity. Plato has Socrates and Plato have a big role in that as well.
When we think about the let's say the traditional systems of virtue cultivation in the West, that's necessarily a kind of unification of Athens and Jerusalem.
Yeah. I agree with that. I think because the Greeks give us the cardinal virtues, courage, wisdom, sophroson, and justice. Which right. Remember, there was 4, by the way, not just justice. There's 4. And then of course Christianity gave us faith, hope, and love, agape, and faith and hope, and that's a very good set to work with. I'm not saying I'll say it again, neither nostalgia nor utopia, but nevertheless, your point is well taken that we are not doing enough to properly afford people the kind of challenging transformation that is integral to the cultivation of virtue and wisdom, while demanding from them that they aspire to a kind of moral perfection that it is out of sync with the degree to which we educate people. And then we exacerbate that by thinking that, what we need to do is indoctrinate people into sets of propositions that they assert without any question, which is not any of what you and I have been talking about, and certainly not what Return to the Source was all about.
It is in some sense, it's the
Return to the Source was Rafe's was an event that Rafe ran that John participated in. They talked about it during this conversation.
The tyranny of the propositional again.
Totally.
Your virtue is measurable by your adherence to a specific set of ever-changing propositions.
Okay, right there. The tyranny of the propositional. Your virtue is measured by your adherence to a set of ever-changing propositions. And I think this is a big part of what's going on with the interest and fascination around Kanye. Let's finish up this clip.
Yes.
As opposed to intrinsic to your attunement to relationships that play out in your actual actions. Was an aspiration.
What makes Kanye so interesting is how he selectively adheres to certain propositions while just sort of running around them. Now, if he were a homeless guy over on the street here, people would pay no attention to him because they'd say he's crazy. And look at the sanity conversation that we've been having. But he is a guy who has, apparently, I haven't checked it out myself, multi-billion-dollar businesses, obviously an extremely successful music career, a very successful design and fashion career. He is a guy. Again, how do we look at the world to try to figure out sanity? It's sort of, we do it through other people, we outsource it through other people, but we also try to measure that against all other sort of fixed points. And the fact that he's a wealthy individual and he didn't inherit this money. Both of his parents sound like quite remarkable people. His mother was a university professor. His father was a former Black Panther, and he speaks very highly about his father and his mother. And part of what makes this interesting is that his relationship with the propositional is erratic and peculiar, but he does so in a way that sort of undermines the large assumed propositional world the way it is. Okay, now those who don't know, Lex Fridman is of Russian ancestry and also Jewish ancestry. And if you know anything about the history of Jewry in Russia, it's a very painful one. And then throw the Holocaust on top of it and centuries of anti-Semitism, it's an enormously painful thing. But he's sitting across from an African American, and if you know anything about the history of the African slave trade, Africans in America, it's an enormously painful history. And so there are moments when they're sort of like, well, let's just put all this behind us and let's just deal with people as individuals. Okay. But at the same time, we can't just put all that behind us and not take into account the long and bitter history and the continual resurgence of either racism against people of African ancestry, or racism and anti-Semitism against people of Jewish ancestry. And again, back to some of our principles about conversation, because these two have a relationship with at least some durability and a friendship, they can have a different conversation than Kanye can have with Piers Morgan.
More love to the world. I would love you to do that as a person.
That doesn't mean that I hate them.
Yes,
that just means that they are.
Just say one thing.
But they are, though. That's the only thing. It just so happens that they are. It just so happens that they are. That doesn't mean that I hate them.
Yes,
that just means that they are.
But it's a dog whistle. Two, let me just say, as I would love to add more love to the world, I would love you to do that as a person with a big voice, with a big, powerful voice that a lot of people look up to. And when you say Jewish media, it's funny how this world works that way. When you say Jewish media, or Jews are controlling the voice of Black artists, Black people, Black artists, when you say that...
Am I not allowed to say it out loud?
You can say it. There's a large number of people that are hurting and have anger and even have hate in their heart when they hear Jewish media. That hate starts being directed towards the Jewish people. Do you acknowledge that? Do you understand? Can you feel the hate in the world? That comes to the surface when you say stuff like that.
Okay, I feel that when we go into therapy, my dad was a therapist, and obviously I've got some therapy skills myself. A lot of people, my music is healing. These type of spa-like existences are healing. The color palettes I use are healing. And we can use healing words, right? What I really feel that there's no accountability and no responsibility on Jewish people in media to at least start with owning up with the facts of what's dealt with and tell me if I say the facts out loud, to the point of Ari Emanuel writing a letter in the Financial Times trying to take food out of my children's mouth, telling people that they're not allowed to work with me. Even Chris Como or Piers Morgan getting me to apologize and separate Jewish business people from the families of the Jewish business people, which I did. Update. I did that. That already happened. And
that was a shitty apology. That wasn't really an apology. But shout out to that conversation.
I need to get on my knees and kiss the dick of Howard Stern. And
you don't need to kiss anyone's dick.
But that's what you guys are acting like.
You guys, look at that.
Because you're talking about it's a shitty apology. But where's our fucking apology? Watch this.
Sorry.
We don't get. Thank you. Now done. Let's move on.
Sorry.
Okay, so part of what makes Kanye So Peugeot had a tweet, and pretty sure it was about Kanye. He tweets, "Keep watching the fool, folks. I never said follow him. I never said agree with him. I said watch. He is acting like a lightning rod and antenna for the hidden taboos and limits in a moment when the world is in danger of blowing up. The story isn't over yet." Now, we talked about the propositional, and something that comes through. Shoot, did I get the whole clip? Because there's a little bit more in that clip with Vervaeke. I should pull it out. Basically, the heart of it was that part of what develops in modernity, and this, of course, is deeply connected to Protestantism and the rise of the propositional, and I'm dealing with this to a degree in my own denomination, is the idea that if you adhere to stating certain propositional truths, then you signal to the rest of the world that you're on the right team, you're with the right group, you can be trusted, you're the right kind of people. And so what happens is that you get all of these in sort of some of the woke wars, you get all of these propositional truths that everyone must adhere to. And when you get to the Kanye interview, part of how he is scrambling is that one moment he'll say something that will sound terribly woke, and when he's talking about history of racism against African Americans and the system, and how African Americans are silenced, and then he'll turn around and say something that will get him cheers on Fox News, where he'll talk about the genocide against African Americans via abortion, and so what I watch when I watch this happen is all of this selective hearing, because on one hand he's getting applause on Fox News because he is sort of completely destroying many of the propositional based arguments about, well, black people can't be racist. But now you've got people all over the place announcing that Kanye is a racist, and so therefore he should be canceled. And it gets back to this sort of propositional approach. And you see this in sort of the development of non-player characters in the world, okay? Because how we tend to work together as groups. Remember, we're talking about collectives, relevance, realization, and sanity. How we tend to work together as groups are that we all line up certain propositions about the world and we repeat them regularly, and this signals to each other that we're all in the group. And then we have all these other signals, either by verbal cleverness or virtue signaling, and I don't mean that necessarily even a pejorative way, but demonstrations one way or another where we're competing sort of in a hierarchy surrounded by these propositions in order to keep our community together and keep the people together and have this all work together. And what Kanye does is he completely scrambles this stuff. And so I think Peugeot was talking about Kanye. He didn't say here, but he's acting like a lightning rod, an antenna for the hidden taboos and limits in a moment when the world is in danger of blowing up. Now, however you want to deal with that, in danger of blowing up, what Kanye is doing is in fact blowing up these stands of confessional, propositional truthiness that are all over the place. And so he's the fool because people don't know how to categorize him. Because again, sometimes he will say things that sound as woke as anyone about the treatment of African Americans. And then he'll turn around and say something tremendously anti-Semitic, and that isn't always necessarily too far from the woke. There are some other fairly anti-Semitic things that wokeism says, and people like Barry Weiss have been pointing this out. And then he'll switch around and seem to be on the other side of the culture war about how he likes Trump, how he's against abortion, how he's being silenced, why can't he say the truth? And he's just going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And people look at this and, oh, we've heard a diagnosis of bipolar. Okay, well, maybe this is mania. I'm not a doctor. looks a little bit manic. We'll see if he crashes. Piers Morgan and Lex both asked him, when they ask him, how are you sleeping, or did you sleep last night, or something like that. That's a, talk about words leaking out of their little professional containers. That's a way with anybody with enough experience with people who are bipolar can pretty quickly ask someone to get a sense of whether or not they are stable or cycling back and forth. And of course, Kanye's been all over the talk shows. Now, will he disappear? He's also got some huge things in his life. Obviously, the breakup with his wife, who he quite clearly continues to love, his children, his very clear commitment to his form of Christianity that he's been expressing. He's got his Sunday services. I mean, he's done a ton of really interesting stuff. He does not look low energy. Now, whether he's going to cycle into a period of depression, or sometimes he calls it exhaustion, there's not a lot of difference necessarily between exhaustion and depression in certain ways, at least from the inside, how it feels. Depressed people are always exhausted often. So, but again, this charge of he's crazy is just sort of dismissive. And it's easy to dismiss, and it's sort of a workaround from the staid, propositional, explicit and implicit, formalized and informal religious, moral, social, ideological frameworks that we are living around. And in some ways, Kanye comes through like a bull in a china shop and just knocks them all over. This in a time when we're in significant transition about all of this supposedly set wisdom. And remember, buzzwords are holy words, and all of these little phrases that we use to sort of mark out who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, who are the people on my side, who are the people against, yada, yada, yada. I want to cut back to more from Scott Adams after he heard the Lex interview.
All right, how many of you saw the interview between Lex Fridman and Ye? So this is brand new. And it was interesting because Lex is Jewish and wanted to push pretty hard on Ye's recent statements. And I saw a tweet on it that this is not my opinion, this is somebody else's tweet, but it matched my opinion. And this is a tweet that said, I was entirely prepared to have my attention captivated by this conversation, but after 20 minutes or so, Ye sounds less like a visionary genius and much more like many fairly ordinary people I've worked with who suffer from bipolar disorder. And I wondered, did anybody else watch that interview and think that they were seeing mental illness as opposed to genius? I don't know if there are enough people who saw that.
No, Scott is a cagey character in this.
Disagree? Agree? Well, here's my opinion. I don't exactly agree with this comment, but I resonated with it. Here's my take. As somebody who is a creative person professionally myself for many, many years now, there's one thing I can say with a fair bit of certainty, that you can't be creative unless you're crazy. I just don't know that those are disconnected. I think you have to be crazy. Now,
Now this gets into, again, think about all of these propositions of, let's say, staves in the grounds, and they're all over the place. And, what we're doing right now is asking questions. We're practicing collective relevance realization, and we're asking questions about sanity. Now, if you go back to the one video, another Lex Fridman conversation with the psychologist about basically us being on a spectrum, there certainly are people that are up and down. You've often heard me comment that in some ways, Paul of Tarsus seems sometimes bipolar. There are times when he's just very up and other times when he's sort of down, and high energy and low energy, and, planting churches all over the place or stuck in prison. And, again, this coming out of Scott Adams, who I just made a video about, his depression, according to him, caused by his beta blockers. He starts taking the pill, and the next day, boom, he's up. Now, his comments here about highly creative people are also true. And those of you who know artists know that, in fact, I remember back in the Willow Creek days, there are whole books written and material written to try to help pastors understand the worship leaders in their churches. Because the worship leaders were these artists, and they were moody, and they had all of this stuff going on inside of them. And then you also had these, at least in the Willow Creek seeker modes, you had these senior pastors who were sort of like mix between preachers and entrepreneurial CEOs who believed in systems, and the two sides didn't mix, because the musicians emotionally would be up and down and excited and depressed, and they're just doing their feelings, and by their feelings everybody sort of connects with them, and that's how we sort of do the it's not even collective cognition, it's collective feeling. And again, music does this so well, and this is what you look for in a great worship leader, someone who can sort of mobilize and catalyze a feeling and a mood or something in the room, and in a sense take the whole congregation on their back and go up and down with the drama of the liturgy or the songs or whatever's going on. And so it's a very different thing from especially the executive pastor who's managing the budget and looking at this and that. So there's a ton going on with this stuff. And so what Adam says here is really important. Again, look what we're doing. We're doing collective relevance realization. What's the relevant thing about these extremely chaotic, episodic interviews with Kanye? You're not really quite sure what to make of it. Now, it's easy to sort of say, okay, he's manic. All right, well, what next? So there's nothing to listen to here because he's manic. Now, remember, being bipolar isn't just being manic, it's a cycle. And there's up and downs, and sometimes these up and downs can have fairly regular rhythms. I had a man who spent some time here at the church with me who was bipolar quite significantly, and he had his bipolar workbook, and he tracked his cycles, and we would talk a lot about his experience of this disease, of his patterns, of his styles. We talk a lot about that. And he would talk about other people who would be diagnosed and say, yeah, here I got this workbook, and this workbook sort of helps me chart my cycles. Again, the guy who lived against my office door for 8 years was severely bipolar, and I pretty much knew his cycles basically by living with him every day on the other side of a door. When he was manic, and he'd come to me and say, Pastor, I haven't had any sleep for 3 days. Oh boy, here we go. And then of course he would go down, and then he wouldn't get out of the filth outside of my office door for 3 days. And I've seen this again and again. But okay, but you've got this individual, that the person who slept on my door, the person who worked in my office, that doesn't mean that everything they say is invalid. You still have to weigh. And I would imagine if in fact he is cycling, it's extremely hard on a family and on a spouse, because what does your partner look like today, and how's that relationship going to go when one day he's up and one day he's down, or depending on how his cycle goes, et cetera, et cetera. But what Scott is saying here is actually extremely important.
If you're disconnected, unless you're crazy, I just don't know that those are disconnected. I think you have to be crazy. Now, if you're lucky, you have a kind of crazy that isn't too obvious to other people. Like, that's your best case scenario. But if you're yay, and you sort of live publicly in many ways, it's a little harder to hide it. But here's the thing. If we say that we're seeing somebody who's got mental illness, and by the way, he said he's off all of his meds, which is an interesting thing. Because it does make me think that other people told him that the way he's acting now is something that needs to be drugged away. I don't know if that happened, but it sounds like it did. Do you think it was Ye himself who decided that he was going to be on whatever medications he was on? Or do you think a doctor decided and he went along with it? Or that family members said, hey, you better listen to this doctor? I mean, it sounds a little like maybe somebody else thought he should act differently.
And I deal with this often with people who, let's say, go into a hospital. And what does the hospital want? The hospital wants compliance. The hospital doesn't want drama. The hospital wants sort of people leveled out. But that leveled out has other implications. I've seen that with family members. Oh, I'm just trying to hold my job together. I want my kid leveled out, or I want my kid compliant, or I want my kid, that's why we put screens in front of these kids, so we don't have to pay time and attention to them. So there's a lot going on here. And again, it's collective and communal.
Or act different. And here's the thing. Who are you or I to judge his mental health? What exactly is the standard by which we compare it? Because normally mental health is based on not exactly objective criteria so much as whether it affects your life and the life of other people. Right?
Is there a clear line between dysfunction and function, disorder and order?
This is always debated in psychiatry, probably more so than any other, medical specialty. I'm a psychiatrist. I treat patients still. I see acutely ill people who come to the emergency room where there's no doubt that this is not something that's working well, where the manifestation of disease is so powerful, where the person is suffering so greatly, where they cannot continue as they are. But of course, it's a spectrum, and there are people who are closer to the realm of being able to work okay in their jobs, but suffer from some small dysfunction, and everywhere in between. In psychiatry, we're careful to say we don't call it a disease or a disorder unless there's a disruption in social or occupational functioning. But of course,
is this a disruption in social functioning? Boy, that's a really complex question.
Psychiatry has a long way to go in terms of developing quantitative tests. We don't have blood draws. We don't have imaging studies that we can use to diagnose. And so that line ultimately that you're asking about between order and disorder, function and dysfunction, it's operational of the moment. How are things working?
Right? So mental illness, no matter how much of the checklist you hit, is still not really mental illness unless it's hurting your life or hurting somebody else's. Now, you could argue that Ye is making people upset. You could argue that he hurt himself by getting himself canceled. But you're only watching the third act. You tell me that you put Ye in the third act of a movie and it's not going to go his way? Have you been paying attention for his entire career? I wouldn't bet against him.
Now, this is, if you've listened to enough Scott Adams, and I haven't listened to that much of him, but this is tremendously reminiscent of his, what he used to say about Trump. Now, part of the difficulty of evaluation is always when and where. And again, in the previous video, his own self-evaluation said, if I continue to feel like this, I'm going to end it all, but I've got my year rule. And the next day, when he gave up on his beta blockers, well, I feel great. And so it's very, very difficult for us to evaluate. I mean, this video of Kanye might look very, very different to us 2 or 3 years from now than today. Might. We don't know.
Even if you say he's totally crazy. He's not more crazy than he ever was. He didn't suddenly get extra crazy, I don't think. I mean, maybe he did, but I doubt it. I feel like this is the exact amount of crazy that made him $11 billion, according to his estimate. I heard somebody else say $4 billion. I don't know if any of those estimates are good, especially now that he got canceled by stuff. But he's a billionaire. He claims he's the richest a black person in, I don't know, America or the world or something.
Now, again, it's interesting because, well, we're trying to figure out sanity. We're trying to do it collectively. We're doing it with comparisons. And again, if someone's on the street and they're homeless and they're broke or they're on disability, we say, well, there's a clear case. It's not working. Well, here's a guy. Well, is it working or not working? Well, what's the definition of working? Then we say, well, he's got a pile of money. That's something. What is it? We're not sure. Is he? Are there other games under this game? And of course, this is the kind of stuff that Adams really shines on.
So it's hard to bet against somebody who has a track record. I loved what he said to Piers Morgan in an interview earlier. When Ye asked Piers how much money Piers had, and Piers, said something modest about he was comfortable. And Ye said he doesn't take business advice from people who have less money than he does. Now, that's more of a bumper sticker joke, but it's a good one. Like, it's a good joke because it hits right where he wanted it to hit. It hits right there. Yeah, Michael Jordan.
And again, with a line like that, and I've seen this with people who, have diagnoses and the chaotic life around them to demonstrate it, sometimes have an observational perspective that sort of cuts right through all of the staves that are planted in the ground and all of the propositions that are sort of making up the communal mental map of sanity and relevance realization that we are living in at any given time. I see it often.
Who's going to give Michael Jordan basketball advice? Like, if you're better than him, sure, but good luck. So the first thing is, I would say that I do see the bipolar. I would say that anybody who looked at that and said they could detect mental illness as it is normally identified in the normal world, I saw it too. Doesn't mean I'm right. I'm not a professional, bipolar spotter. I'm just saying that it just screams out mental illness. But illness, again, is a bigoted word, isn't it? Mental illness is a bigoted word. I should say...
It's helpful to remember that part of how California got in the state it's in is that in the 70s and 80s, there was all kinds of legislation that giving patients rights and saying, let them go out on the street and fend for themselves within limits. If they assault somebody, they're going to go to jail. But it's very hard in California to actually lock someone up for being just crazy if they are not violating other laws against people's property or their persons. That might change because of what all's been happening, but again, here's a guy who has billions of dollars apparently and is loved and is followed.
Mentally different. How about that? He's mentally diverse. How about that? Mentally diverse. I mean, he's the most diverse mind that we have in America. He might be the most diverse thinker we have. Because he can say white lives matter. He can say he's fighting for black people. He can say anything. He's got the whole spectrum, and nobody else has that. So,
this is where, one moment he sounds woke, the next moment he sounds like a diehard Republican, and we can't place him on our spectrum again. Keep watching the fool, folks. I never said follow him. I never said agree with him. I said watch. He's acting like a lightning rod, an antenna for the hidden taboos and limits. In a moment when the world is I wouldn't say in danger of blowing up. Well, it could be, but when the world is transitioning, when everything is sort of, all those staves are getting knocked over and everybody wonders, where will the new staves be put in the ground? Because, there are people, there are people, calling for that. Oh, we have to dismember everything because it's all shot through with racism against black folks. And if you ask Kanye, he'll say yes, and it's the Jews. And Lex will say, no, wait a minute, this led to Germany. You can't go there. And so what that means is that we're in one of these transition moments when all of the staves are out of the ground, all of our orientation fixtures are missing, and we're looking at each other and we're listening to each other and we're trying to reconstruct a mental map of the world that we can all agree on and figure out what sanity is.
So if mental illness allowed him to be the only person in the world who can see everything, well, that's a weird mental illness. It made him a billionaire who can see the entire field. So he can see what white people are thinking, he can see what black people are thinking, and he may be on the verge of learning what Jewish people are thinking, but not there yet. Definitely not there yet, unless he's doing it as a provocation intentionally, which he might be. He might be intentionally provoking just for effect.
And that wouldn't be inconsistent with his clear agenda with respect to the painful history of African Americans in America, in the Americas, frankly. And, Scott's about to say it.
I'll give you another factoid that may or may not be influencing Ye's behavior lately. He told a story on...
well, maybe he'll say it a little bit later, but maybe I thought of it after listening to this the first time. Does Kanye West not understand about the history of anti-Semitism? I mean, is this a piece of information that is somehow avoided? Now, again, they have all these levels of understanding and feeling heard, and but it would see. I mean, and then he says this stuff about that he's Jewish, and I'm not even going to go down that whole thing, but provocation in terms of his agenda, and which agenda? To reset his business proposition now after his divorce, to try to reset his standing in the world. Now we're all talking about him. He's got our attention. He's winning the eyeball campaign. 2.5 million hits on Lex Fridman's conversation with him, when Lex's videos get usually in the 100,000s, might go up over 1 million if it's an especially popular person. But bang, now Ye is at the top of the heap. Is he doing this to win his girl back? Is he doing this to make more millions? Is he doing this? You almost get the impression from him that he's the kind of guy who has learned to just do, and it works for him. Now, it doesn't work for many people, or maybe he's just super savvy, and part of him is just doing, and another part of him behind is sort of managing this, and he's just got really good intuitions of what to just do to have success. But again, if you look at his biography, there are plenty of biographies of him online that go over some of his just doing winds up as an absolute disaster. But he's sort of been on a good run for the last while that has earned him billions of dollars and a position in the culture that is extremely unusual. To say some of the things that he says about liberation of African Americans and justice with respect to the black experience versus being lauded on Fox News as a champion against abortion. As Adam said, who else is sort of running that gamut?
His interview with Lex, that at one point he got a phone call that he didn't recognize the number. It was Pete Davidson telling them that Pete Davidson was at that moment in bed with Ye's wife, who I take it he's still in love with and wants to get back with, based on what he said at the interview. Now, imagine being Ye. You've got 2 or 3 kids with Kim Kardashian, and he says that she was like the real love. Like, he's clearly still in love with Kim Kardashian. Yeah, he's not hiding that at all. And he clearly would like to be back with her and with his family. And Pete Davidson called him from in bed with his fucking wife Now, if that really happened, Pete Davidson is a real piece of shit. Now, I don't know if it happened, but if that's true, oh my fucking God. Now, I don't know what Ye may have done to Pete Davidson to make him think that was an appropriate move. You have to hear both sides, but it's horrifying. Yeah. Somebody says, Angel says it didn't happen. Maybe. Who knows? Yeah, it does sound a little too horrifying to be true, but we don't really have a record of Ye lying to us, do we? I can't think of one.
Now, this is another really interesting point, because
has Ye ever told like a direct, like a factual lie?
And that then, just really scrambles. Crimgris has a thumbnail out there with, he's been watching Jordan Peterson's numbers get higher to 300 and made a fake thumbnail of Peterson and Ye on there, and tell the truth, don't lie, as the subtext. Is pretty genius there, Grizz. But okay, does he lie to us? How are we to categorize his statements about the Jews? Oh, racist, or but in terms of look at how Adams is defining lie.
Is there any history of that? It's an Andrew Tate move. Yeah, kind of. All right, anyway. So I'm going to say that there's no difference between Ye's alleged bipolar, what you would call mental illness, and what I would call creative genius. But did you see creative genius in the Lex Fridman interview? It was kind of a mixed bag. There were moments that I could certainly think looked like genius, and there were other moments that looked like something else. But again, he's the billionaire. I'm not. I'm not a billionaire. So can I really judge anything he did as wrong? Now, apparently Adidas has dropped him, which some have suggested that was his plan. His plan was to get full control back of all of his assets once he had built them into a valuable thing. If he gets it back and he starts his own business and people buy from him, he will be much richer than if he worked with Balenciaga and Adidas. And he said a funny thing that you could only be mentally ill and a genius to say. He said of Balenciaga, who stopped their thing, he goes, in X number of years, I forget what he said, what will be the bigger thing, Yeezy or Balenciaga? In 5 years, are you going to be talking about Balenciaga or Yeezy? And I thought to myself, oh yeah, he's right about that. Balenciaga was the one that lost, because he's more famous than they are in terms of the general public. I don't even know who they were. I never heard of them before. I guess some fashion house or clothing maker or something. I don't know. Who knows? But it must be said that the major theme there was Lex trying to get Ye to admit or understand. And here's the part we don't know. We don't know what Ye is thinking. We can only know what he says. And Ye acted almost as if he didn't understand, which is the part I doubt. He acted like he wasn't getting the point that talking about Jewish people as a group, when he's criticizing, can lead you to the worst possible outcome. And he kept saying, but it's true. He kept saying that the majority of the people who cause me problems happen to be Jewish. So he says, why can't I say that if it's just true? And Lex is trying to explain, that's not the point. The point is not whether it's true. The point is you're making a statement about all Jews when really there were just individuals who were your problem. And I'm sure he understands that, because anybody would. But he he refused to sort of acknowledge it, like to speak it back or to debate it directly. He was always sort of like a little off to the left. And Lex, to his credit, went really hard at him. Like, I don't know if I've ever seen anybody go harder at somebody in an interview. So Lex, props. He went really hard. Now, the problem was apparently they're friends. I didn't know that, but apparently Lex and Ye have known each other and they're friends. And I think that maybe the friendship or even the celebrity part tends to distort things. But it was fascinating to watch Lex, in my opinion, quite legitimately bothered by what Ye said, and quite legitimately bothered that Ye wouldn't admit that what he had done could have some negative consequences. And yet he kept, joking and kept like the friendship up. And I guess I went away feeling a little, sort of thinking about it for a long time. And I said to myself, did I just see the best thing I ever saw, which is two people really going at each other hard and remaining friends? Because they did. They went hard and they stayed friends. Or, no, that would be the best case scenario, right? Or did I see somebody who was an anti-Semite refuse to, fess up? I feel like it was both. I mean, and then let me say something that I wonder if this will get me canceled. Well, let's see. Let's see if I get canceled. All right. I am very anti-racism. I do not like racists. And
then he goes off on that for a while. All right, think about it this way: you have all these staves, and we'll even have Chesterton's fence over here in the background. But you've just basically got all these staves, and these are all sort of propositional things, and there's many of them all over the place, and we pay attention to them, and we navigate by them. And in Christianity, one might be the Trinity. One might be the resurrection of Jesus. One might be the crucifixion of Jesus. All these propositional staves that sort of make up the world. And now propositions are hugely useful because they, more than a lot of the other features, have durability, and they're sort of eternal. You can locate them and they don't go away. That's part of the reason they're so beloved in modernity. We all like them, and all this propositional truth that we can all sort of align, and then we as little people sort of walk among them, and we can orient ourselves, and then as groups of little people, we sort of agree on certain staves and all orient ourselves by them in our little group. And some of this can then turn into like a non-player character, and where here we're all together. This is how we derive our identity. This is how we derive our community. This is how we do this, and we defend our little group based on our view of all the different propositions and where they land. And this is how we do collective relevance realization. This is how we do distributed cognition. It gives us sort of a stable landscape. And part of what's been happening is that we're in a time period where these staves are falling down, and we're not sure about them. A lot of people, well, I disagree with the incarnation. I disagree with the resurrection. I disagree with these things. And that of course
obviously disturbs all of the groups of people that have oriented themselves individually and communally in time and space by virtue of all of these various different staves. And you've got someone like Kanye who comes onto the mix and will make him really big, because in some ways he's a really big person in that he's got lots of money, and he's got lots of fame, and he's got lots of visibility, and he's got lots of power. And, he starts pushing down these staves, rearranging these staves, and of course his friend Lex comes around and tries to engage him, and they're going to fight about the history of anti-Semitism, et cetera, et cetera. It's just a very dynamic system moving around.
And I think, this to me gets into what was quite an interesting conversation again on Jacob's channel yesterday. This was sort of the midwit war. And I don't mean that any of these people are midwits or that whole meme that's going around, but Nathan has almost become a stock item in this conversation at this point, because Jacob and Mark are calling Nate a midwit and basically saying no one should listen to him. And Richard, who went on Nate's channel, said, I don't believe in doing that. I don't believe in calling people by those names. And then a little bit later, Grim Grizz shows up and he wades in and he's sort of on Richard's side, and he's not having it. I watched some of this in the airport in Burbank as I was in the line for Southwest, and just fascinated by all the different takes that people are having on it and going back and forth. And here's why I think the Staves is a better way of understanding what's going on. Because I've never found much utility in just ranking people by their IQ. Because what I've found, as I mentioned before in one of my videos about, let's say, Christians with low IQ that regularly outperform in terms of Christian virtue Christians with high IQs, that it's not so much the speed of the processor. There's a lot more involved when it comes down to evaluating how a person is in the world and behaves in the world. What I see more of is that some individuals act like, the whole non-player character meme. They work with their own little group over here, let's say, and they work to battle, let's say, another group over here. And what they're doing is they're sort of defending their map of the staves in the field. And Christians do this often between other Christians or non-Christian groups, so on and so forth. But the groups are basically functioning sociologically, and they gain rank by doing so within their group. If they're seen as defending their group well, as putting down the other guy, as winning, they then, their stock rises. If they see themselves as getting beaten, then their stock falls. But in my, obviously intelligence sometimes has something to do with this, but intelligence is just one factor, and I'm not sure a tremendously important factor in terms of actually being able to understand the complexity of the entire landscape. It's an aid if you have a high IQ, perhaps, but there's so many other variables, such as when you were born, to whom you were born, the education that you've had, the biases that you have, the people that are around you, on and on and on and on and on. And what we tend to find in many people is that they simply adopt the mentality of their group and they stick with it. And even if they're sometimes a little bit on the bipolar section, schizophrenics don't function very well like this just because they can't group up very well with other people because their vision of the entire field is just radically different and disrupted because of the schizophrenia. Depressed people don't do a lot because they're depressed, let's say, but the function isn't about IQ or smarts. And so ranking people by their level of intelligence and either dismissing them because of it doesn't really work, sort of in the same way as dismissing people because of some perceived or diagnosed mental illness. That can, in some cases, if they're a schizophrenic, especially, it depends very much on the type of mental disorder and the degree to which and the context in which it's operating. All of those things have a lot to do, but it's not just about general intelligence. It's so often about someone's life story and the people that they are getting support from and their tribe and how they're going to defend it. Now, whether their arguments are good or not, that sometimes will have more dependence upon, let's say, their intelligence, but often not as much as we might imagine, because they're part of their community. And so when I look at these four guys, they're creative, they're intelligent. Richard is a young man. He's just starting off college, but he's skilled. He's a skilled musician. He's very smart. He learns very quickly. He's sort of soaking all of this up from this little corner of the internet. Grim Grizz is quite chaotic, but obviously highly intelligent and comes at things from a very different perspective. Obviously, also both Jacob and Mark, also both highly intelligent. They've had success in their fields. They've been able to attain education and many status markers in this world. But most of this is not about intelligence. Most of this is about the nature of the landscape. And when you have someone like Kanye, who drops into something like this and starts rolling things over, well, you're going to get to a place where basically, especially at this point in time, landscapes are going to get remade. And who does what isn't necessarily a function of their mental illness within certain parameters or their intelligence within certain parameters. It's a function of way, way more factors involved in the mix. And so a conversation with someone like Kanye, well, this is sort of a checking. And what this does as a society, and I think Peugeot has a point here, is what Kanye is sort of doing is illuminating the field. And of course, depending on where people are located, they'll defend their tribe, or they'll defend their staves, or they'll defend whatever it is that they value on the field. Their arguments might be good, their arguments might be bad, but generally speaking, argumentation is only one variable and factor in terms of our view of the landscape, and even less so in terms of the values and the things that we protect in that landscape. And that's certainly true of, let's say, a guy who is a guy like Scott Adams, who loves to sort of hover above things. And I mean, I play the same games, but hover above things and drop his little nuggets of what he thinks are wisdom. And sometimes they are wise, and sometimes maybe less so wise, and sometimes they're just his biases and whatever little game he's playing. And a guy like Kanye, you watch and you just think, what game is he exactly playing? And you don't know. And you try and figure it out. But I think the main thing is, in fact, that we're in this period of rapid dislocation. Staves are being pulled out of the ground, and staves are being put in the ground, and communities are forming and communities are not forming. And people are deriving their definitions of sanity and insanity based often on their sort of grouped worldview. And so, yeah, you can make a lot of friends having a YouTube channel that defends your tribe. Kanye just kind of rolls through and scatters things, and you don't know what is what or where it is, but all of that chaos sort of illuminates it. Think about him. I don't think like sort of a, sending up a flare into the sky so that it can be seen. I see more as him just sort of moving around the field, and when he bumps into something, we say, oh. And a guy like Scott Adams is sort of your tourist on the way, pointing out what's here and what's there. Now, I expect, there's right now a lot of attention to Kanye, and this will die down. If he does a conversation with Jordan Peterson, it's going to be interesting. That's the one I want to see Jordan drag Peugeot in with. That's the conversation I want to see. So, Yeah, I think so. How to evaluate the Kanye conversations? I think Peugeot has a real point that what he's doing is illuminating things. He's illuminating the set structures that we see, and many of the other individuals that we see operating in these spaces are just sort of being the chattering rider on top of NPC elephants, justifying their group and explaining their group and playing a group game. And then it's always interesting when people sort of get off the elephant and get on another one. Someone like, let's say, Dave Rubin or Kanye for that matter. Kanye is just bouncing all up and down all these different elephants and highlighting all these different staves and knocking bunches of them down to the point that people begin to realize new staves are going to be put in the ground. New coalitions are going to form. New perspectives are going to emerge. And that's, in fact, what creative, what stubborn people do, what people who consequential leaders do. So I don't know if this made any sense, but again, for me, this is thinking out loud and trying to get a sense of how the world works. So leave a comment. Let me know what you think.